Stage 4, asset inflation, accelerated dramatically in the 1990s and 2000s. Stage 5, wealth polarization, is now worse than during the Gilded Age. Stage 6, the collapse of social mobility, has effectively killed the American dream. And Stage 7, political instability, is where we currently find ourselves in 2025. You can't afford to buy a house, not because you're lazy, but because houses now cost 7 times your income, compared to the 6 times they cost your grandparents. You're burdened by overwhelming student debt, not because you made poor choices, but because college has become 8 times more expensive than inflation would predict. You can't afford healthcare, not because you don't work hard, but because healthcare costs consume 40% of your income, compared to the 8% it consumed for previous generations. You're worse off than your parents, not because you're not trying, but because the system has been restructured to benefit the wealthy at your expense. The pattern is undeniable. 6 empires all destroyed their middle classes, all followed the same 8 stages, and all ended in collapse or revolution. And America is currently in Stage 7. The middle class isn't just dying, it's almost dead. Stage 8 is looming. Perhaps it will be economic collapse triggered by unsustainable debt. Perhaps it will be revolution sparked by a complete loss of faith in the system's legitimacy. Or perhaps, just perhaps, there will be dramatic reform. But the historical pattern suggests that Stage 7 invariably leads to Stage 8, and we are rapidly running out of time. The Roman middle class took 300 years to perish. The Spanish took 150 years. The French took 90 years. The British took 60 years. The Soviet Union took just 30 years. Japan's middle class has been in decline for 35 years and counting. And the American middle class has been dying for 50 years. We are now in Stage 7. Your grandparents lived through Stages 1 and 2. Your parents lived through Stages 3 and 4. You are living through Stages 5, 6, and 7. Your children will likely experience Stage 8 unless something drastically changes. But history indicates that nothing will change, because historical patterns rarely deviate, and the pattern is clear. The American middle class is on the path to extinction. Just like Rome, Spain, France, Britain, the USSR, and Japan, the pattern is repeating itself. Stage 7 is complete. Stage 8 is next. If this has shed light on why you are struggling, why home ownership seems impossible, why hard work no longer leads to prosperity, and why you are worse off than your parents, then consider subscribing. Because you are not failing. The system has failed you. You are witnessing a middle-class extinction event that has played out 6 times before over the course of 2,000 years. Understanding this pattern is the only way to anticipate what's coming next. Stage 8 is on the horizon. The question isn't if it will happen, but when and whether you will be. Your grandparents? They were probably middle class. Your parents, maybe they squeezed into the middle class too. But you? Chances are you're not. And before you start blaming yourself, it's not because you're lazy or didn't bust your butt. It's not because you made a series of terrible life choices either. There's a historical pattern, plain and simple, a pattern that's systematically annihilated the middle class in practically every major empire we've seen over the last 2 millennia. And guess what? That very pattern is unfolding right here in the United States, right now. Picture this. In 100 AD, Rome boasted a flourishing middle class, full of property-owning farmers and skilled tradesmen. Fast forward to 400 AD, and poof. They were gone. Vanished. All that was left were the obscenely wealthy and the desperately poor. In the 1500s, Spain, flush with New World riches, cultivated a merchant middle class. By 1650, wiped out, crushed under the weight of runaway inflation and suffocating taxation. France in the 1700s saw the rise of a professional middle class. By 1789, they'd been radicalized into revolution, driven to the brink by an economic system that had utterly destroyed them. Britain in 1918 possessed one of the strongest middle classes on the planet. By 1979, it was fractured, diminished, a shadow of its former self. The Soviet Union, by the 1960s, had painstakingly built a middle class of educated professionals. By 1991, their savings were utterly worthless. Japan in the 1980s had what many considered the world's most robust middle class. Today, young Japanese folks can barely afford to even think about starting families. 6 empires. 6 middle-class extinctions. All following the exact same, predictable 8-stage pattern. First, prosperity and growth, where a strong middle class takes root and thrives. Second, peak and complacency, where the middle class reaches its maximum size and influence. Third, wage stagnation and rising debt, a dangerous combination. Fourth, asset inflation, making things like housing and education ridiculously unaffordable. Fifth, wealth polarization, creating a stark, two-tiered society. Sixth, the death of opportunity and the collapse of mobility. Seventh, political instability as faith in the system crumbles. And eighth, either systemic collapse or a full-blown, violent revolution. The United States entered stage 1 around 1945, and by 1970, we'd reached stage 2. Over the last half-century, we've been steadily progressing through stages 3 through 6. And right now, here in 2025, we're smack dab in the middle of stage 7. Political instability is rampant, trust in institutions is eroding, and populism is surging on both extremes of the spectrum. The middle class isn't just dying, it's practically dead. And stage 8? It's coming, make no mistake about that. This is the real story of how middle classes die. Why the pattern keeps repeating itself, century after century, continent after continent. And why America is now following the very same path that annihilated the Roman middle class, the Spanish, the French, the British, the Soviet, and the Japanese. The pattern never lies. And the pattern tells us we're already 2/3 of the way through this extinction sequence. But before we trace this pattern through those 6 empires, you need to really understand what a middle class is and why empires keep creating them only to, ultimately, destroy them. A middle class isn't just a bunch of people with medium incomes. It's a specific social and economic structure. The middle class is that group, situated between the wealthy elite and the working poor who own some property, have some degree of economic security, can afford basic necessities and even a little discretionary spending, and most importantly, have genuine hope that their kids will have it better than they did. That last bit is absolutely crucial. Hope. Mobility. The belief that hard work actually leads to advancement. When that belief dies, the middle class dies psychologically, long before it dies economically. Middle classes tend to emerge during periods of economic expansion and opportunity. After wars, when labor is scarce. During technological revolutions, when brand new industries create brand new jobs. During periods of imperial expansion, when wealth flows into the core. Rome's middle class grew during the Republican expansion. Spain's grew from all that American silver. Britain's grew out of the Industrial Revolution. America's grew after World War II, when we were practically the only major economy left standing. But here's the lesson history keeps trying to teach us. Every single empire that creates a middle class eventually destroys it. Not intentionally, not through some grand conspiracy, but through a predictable sequence of policy choices that, time and time again, end up benefiting the elite at the expense of the middle. And once that sequence kicks off, it's almost impossible to stop. The pattern is really quite simple. First, wages stop growing, even as productivity continues to increase. The gains from economic growth flow almost exclusively to owners and the wealthy, while the workers' share shrinks. Second, in order to maintain their living standards despite those stagnant wages, the middle class goes into debt. Consumer debt, mortgages, student loans. Debt becomes the default way to afford what wages simply can't cover anymore. Third, assets inflate. Housing prices, education costs, healthcare costs all rise much faster than wages do. Things that used to be readily accessible to the middle class become luxuries reserved for the wealthy. Fourth, wealth concentrates at the very top. As assets inflate and wages stagnate, the gap between the rich and the middle class grows to an extreme degree. Fifth, opportunity disappears. When wealth matters more than hard work, mobility dies. The ladder gets pulled up. Sixth, political power follows wealth. The wealthy use their power to further rig the system in their favor through taxes, regulations, and policies that benefit them. And seventh, The middle class, seeing that the system is rigged, loses faith in institutions and turns to political extremes. And eighth, either the system reforms dramatically, which almost never happens, or it collapses into either economic breakdown or a revolution. 6 empires have followed this pattern, and all 6 destroyed their middle classes in the process. So let's trace this pattern, starting with ancient Rome and ending with modern America, and see why stage 7 almost always leads to stage 8. Before we dive in, let me lay out that 8-stage pattern explicitly one last time. Stage 1 is prosperity and growth. This is when a middle class emerges or grows strong, usually after a war, during a period of economic expansion, or from some brand new source of wealth. A single income can support a whole family. Home ownership is common. Education is accessible. Savings are possible. Upward mobility is a real thing. Life genuinely gets better with each generation. This stage can last for decades. It's the golden age that older generations remember so fondly and that younger generations hear about but never actually experience. Stage 2 is peak and complacency. The middle class reaches its maximum size, often making up 50 to 60% of the population. Things are good, really good. People start to believe that this prosperity is permanent, that the system is stable, that their children will have the same opportunities they had. This is the stage where everyone believes the good times will last forever. Nobody sees the decline coming. Stage 3 is wage stagnation and rising debt. This is where the decline actually begins. Productivity keeps going up, but wages just stop growing. Those gains flow to the owners and the executives. To keep up their living standards, the middle class starts borrowing. Consumer debt rises. Credit cards, car loans, home equity lines. Debt shifts from being used for major purchases to covering everyday expenses. Stage 4 is asset inflation. Housing prices start rising much faster than incomes. What used to cost 3 times your annual salary now costs 5, 6, even 7 times that. Education that used to be cheap or even free becomes incredibly expensive. Healthcare becomes unaffordable, even with insurance. The very things that define middle-class life, homeownership, education, healthcare, become privileges instead of normal expectations. This stage is devastating because it essentially locks out the next generation. Your parents bought a house when they were 25. You can't even afford to think about buying one at 35. Stage 5 is wealth polarization. As assets inflate and wages stagnate, society splits into 2 distinct tiers. The wealthy, who own assets, see their wealth grow exponentially. The middle class, who depend on wages, see their relative position decline. The gap becomes a chasm. A 2-tiered society emerges where your outcomes are determined by inheritance and connections, not by hard work. Stage 6 is the loss of opportunity and mobility. Income mobility collapses. Education no longer guarantees advancement. Hard work no longer leads to prosperity. That ladder that allowed previous generations to climb is pulled up, leaving everyone else stuck. If you're born middle class, you're likely to stay middle class at best or fall into the working poor. If you're born poor, you stay poor. The American dream becomes the American lottery, possible, but incredibly unlikely. This is where hope goes to die. Stage 7 is political instability. This is where we are right now in America. When the middle class finally realizes that the system is rigged against them, they lose faith in institutions. Trust in government, the media, the courts, it all collapses. Political extremism rises on both the left and the right. Populist movements gain power. Social unrest increases. The system's legitimacy is openly questioned. This is the danger zone. And stage 8 is collapse or revolution. Either the economic system collapses and the middle class is wiped out through inflation, depression, or some kind of systemic breakdown, or a revolution happens, where the middle class, having lost everything else, demands violent redistribution. Sometimes it's a slow collapse that unfolds over decades. Sometimes it's sudden and swift. But once stage 7 is reached, history tells us that stage 8 is almost inevitable. Now, let's watch this pattern play out as it destroys 6 different empires across 2,000 years. The story of the Roman middle class begins during the Republican era and the early Empire. By 100 AD, Rome had a substantial middle class. These were plebeians who owned land, small farmers with maybe 10 to 50 acres, enough to support a family and sell some surplus. Tradesmen, shopkeepers, lower-level officials. They owned property. They had economic security. They could vote. They served in the legions. They were citizens with rights. This was stage 1 and 2. The Roman middle class, at its peak, probably represented 30 to 40% of the free population. Not huge by modern standards, but significant for the ancient world. Stage 3 began around 150 AD. Roman expansion started to slow down. The easy conquests were over. But the costs of defending the empire kept rising. Maintaining legions on distant frontiers was incredibly expensive. Soldiers had to be paid. But tax revenue wasn't growing because expansion had stopped. The solution? Debasement. Roman emperors started mixing base metals into silver coins. A denarius that was supposed to be pure silver became 50% silver, then 30%, then even less. This was the ancient equivalent of printing money, and it had the same effect. Inflation. By 200 AD, prices were rising dramatically. The middle class, who held their savings in coins, saw their wealth evaporate. A lifetime of savings became utterly worthless as the currency was debased. Stage 4 was asset consolidation. The small farmers struggled with inflation and rising taxes. They were forced to sell their land. And who bought it? The wealthy, of course. Large landowners. Latifundia bought up small farms at distressed prices. By 250 AD, land ownership was concentrating in fewer and fewer hands. The middle class of small farmers was disappearing. If you lost your land, you became a tenant farmer or moved to Rome to live on the grain dole. Stage 5 was complete wealth polarization by 300 AD. Roman society was now a two-tiered system, the extremely wealthy senatorial class and the desperately poor masses. The middle class was gone. Senators owned estates the size of small countries. Everyone else was poor. Stage 6 was the death of mobility. In earlier Rome, a farmer's son could become a soldier, then an officer, then a landowner, then maybe even a senator. That path was closed off. By 300 AD, if you were born poor, you died poor. The Roman Empire had become a rigid class society. Stage 7 was political chaos. The 3rd century crisis, 235 to 284 AD, saw 50 emperors in 50 years. Civil wars. Rebellions. The empire nearly collapsed. The middle class, what was left of it, had no faith in the system. And stage 8 was the slow collapse. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. The middle class never recovered. For 1,000 years after Rome fell, there was no substantial middle class in Europe. Feudalism replaced it. Lords and serfs. Rich and poor. No middle. The Roman middle class extinction was so complete that it took a millennium to rebuild. The story of Spain's middle class is shorter, but just as devastating. In the early 1500s, Spain conquered the Americas and discovered the richest silver mines in history: Potosi in Bolivia, Zacatecas in Mexico. Silver poured into Spain by the ton. This created stage 1. A merchant middle class emerged: traders, bankers, professionals. Spain became the richest nation in Europe. The middle class in Spanish cities like Seville and Madrid thrived. This was 1500 to 1550. Stage 2, the peak, was 1550 to 1580. The Spanish middle class probably made up 30 to 35% of the urban population. Things were good. Spain was a superpower. But stage 3 began almost immediately. All that silver caused inflation. Prices rose dramatically as the money supply exploded. By the 1580s, inflation was severe. Wages didn't keep up. The middle class had to borrow to maintain their living standards. And Spain's kings were spending the silver faster than it arrived, fighting wars across Europe and maintaining their vast empire. Debt piled up. Stage 4 was asset inflation. Land prices soared. Only the nobility could afford estates. The middle class was priced out. Housing in cities became expensive. What a merchant salary could buy in 1500 was half what it could buy in 1600. Stage 5 was wealth concentration by the early 1600s. The nobility, who didn't pay taxes, accumulated wealth. The middle class, who did pay taxes and faced rampant inflation, declined. Spain became a two-tiered society, rich nobles and poor peasants. Stage 6 was mobility collapse. The Spanish middle class couldn't advance. The nobility was a closed caste. If you weren't born noble, you'd never be noble. And without land or a title, you simply couldn't accumulate wealth. Stage 7 was crisis. Spain declared bankruptcy 4 times between 1550 and 1650 for sovereign defaults. By 1640, revolts broke out. Catalonia rebelled. Portugal regained its independence. The system was breaking down. And Stage 8 was collapse. By 1650, the Spanish middle class was effectively extinct. The wealth from the Americas was gone, wasted on wars and luxury. Spain went from superpower to secondary power in just 50 years. The middle class never recovered to its 1550 levels. Spain's story teaches us that natural resource wealth can create a middle class. But if that wealth isn't managed properly, it can destroy that middle class through inflation and debt even faster than it was created. France's middle-class extinction culminated in revolution, which is one possible outcome of Stage 8. In the early 1700s, France developed a strong professional middle class: lawyers, doctors, merchants, minor officials. They owned property, had an education, and enjoyed some prosperity. This was Stage 1 and 2. By 1750, the French middle class, what they called the bourgeoisie, was maybe 15 to 20% of the population. Not huge, but influential. Stage 3 began around 1750. France was fighting expensive wars, the 7 Years' War, support for the American Revolution. The costs were enormous, but the French tax system was insane. The nobility and clergy, the first and second estates, paid almost no taxes. The third estate, which included the middle class and the peasants, paid everything. So, as costs rose, taxes on the middle class rose. Stage 4 was the 1770s and 1780s. Bread prices spiked. Housing in Paris became incredibly expensive. The middle class was being squeezed. They were educated. They worked hard. But they were taxed heavily and saw no return. Meanwhile, the nobility lived in luxury at Versailles. Stage 5 was extreme polarization. By 1780, French society was rigidly divided. The nobility flaunted obscene wealth. The middle class struggled despite their education and effort, and the poor starved. Stage 6 was total loss of mobility. If you weren't born noble, you'd never be noble. The middle class hit a ceiling. They could be lawyers and doctors, but they'd never have the real political power or social status that belonged to the nobility by birthright. Stage 7 was 1788 and early 1789. The government was bankrupt. King Louis XVI called the Estates General, a parliament that hadn't met in 175 years, to legitimize new taxes. Instead, the Third Estate, led by the middle class, declared themselves the National Assembly and demanded equal representation. The middle class had lost all faith in the monarchy. They didn't believe the system could be reformed. And Stage 8 was revolution. July 14, 1789. The Bastille was stormed. The French Revolution began. The middle class, radicalized by economic destruction and the loss of hope, helped overthrow the entire system. Thousands were executed. France descended into the reign of terror. The revolution eventually led to Napoleon and decades of war. The middle class didn't win. The revolution consumed them. 2. Many middle-class revolutionaries were themselves executed. Stage 8 in France shows that revolution doesn't save the middle class. It destroys them in a different way. Britain's middle-class extinction happened slowly over about 60 years. In 1918, after World War I, Britain still had a strong middle class: shopkeepers, clerks, teachers, lower-level managers. They were the backbone of British society. This was Stage 2, the peak. Britain's middle class probably made up 40 to 45% of the population in the 1920s. But Stage 3 began almost immediately. World War I had been devastatingly expensive. Britain borrowed heavily from the United States. The costs of maintaining the empire, troops in India, Africa, the Middle East, were enormous. But Britain's economic dominance was fading. Wages stagnated in the 1920s and 1930s while the costs of empire remained. Stage 4 was the interwar period, and especially after World War II. Housing became expensive. London property prices rose while wages didn't. The British middle class was being priced out of homeownership. Education, while better than most countries, was still tiered. Only the wealthy could afford the best schools. Stage 5 was the 1950s and 1960s. Britain lost its empire. India, Africa, all gained independence. The economic benefits of empire were gone. The British middle class saw their relative position decline. The wealth gap grew. The aristocracy remained extremely wealthy, while the middle class stagnated. Stage 6 was the 1960s, and especially the 1970s. British social mobility collapsed. The class system hardened. If you were born working class, you stayed working class. The middle class couldn't advance to the upper class, and working-class children struggled to reach the middle class. The ladder that had existed before was broken. Stage 7 was the 1970s, the winter of discontent. Strikes paralyzed the country. The lights went out. Garbage piled up in the streets. Inflation hit 25%. The middle class, seeing their savings destroyed by inflation and their opportunities limited by a rigid class system, lost faith. Political extremism rose. Stage 8? Britain didn't have a revolution or total collapse, but the middle class never fully recovered. Margaret Thatcher's policies in the 1980s financialized the economy but hollowed out the industrial middle class. By 2000, the British middle class was smaller than it had been in 1950. Today, young British people face the same problems as young Americans: unaffordable housing, stagnant wages, less opportunity than their parents. The British middle class went from 45% of the population in 1950 to maybe 30% today. It wasn't destroyed as dramatically as in Rome or France, but it was significantly diminished. Stage 8 in Britain was slow decline rather than sudden collapse. The Soviet Union's middle-class extinction was unique because it happened in a communist system, but the pattern was the same. By the 1960s and 1970s, the USSR had developed a middle class of sorts: engineers, doctors, teachers, lower-level party officials. They didn't own property in the Western sense, but they had stability, decent wages relative to workers, and access to better goods. This was stage 1 and 2. The Soviet middle class might have been 20 to 25% of the population. They were educated, urban, and relatively prosperous by Soviet standards. Stage 3 began in the late 1970s, and especially the 1980s. Soviet economic growth stagnated. The centrally planned economy simply couldn't keep up with the West. Wages didn't rise, but more importantly, the official economy stopped functioning. Necessities had to be bought on the black market. The Soviet middle class had to use connections, bribes, and black market trading just to maintain basic living standards. Stage 4 was the 1980s under Gorbachev. Even with perestroika reforms, the system was breaking down. Goods were scarce. Official prices were a fiction. The black market was the only real economy. The Soviet middle class's savings, held in rubles and state banks, were becoming worthless because there was nothing to buy with them. Stage 5 was the late 1980s. Soviet society became two-tiered: the party elite, with access to special stores and foreign goods, and everyone else, struggling to get by. The party elite lived like the Western middle class. The Soviet middle class lived in scarcity. Stage 6 was mobility collapse. If you weren't in the party elite, you couldn't advance. The Soviet system was supposed to be egalitarian, but it had become a rigid hierarchy. Stage 7 was 1989 to 1991. The Soviet Union was falling apart. Republics were declaring independence. The Communist Party was losing legitimacy. The middle class had lost all faith in the system. They'd spent decades being told they were building a better future, and they saw that it was a lie. And Stage 8 was the collapse of 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved. The ruble became worthless. Hyperinflation hit 2,500 to 500% in 1992. The Soviet middle class's life savings, maybe 50,000 or 100,000 rubles saved over a lifetime, became worth less than a month's groceries. They were wiped out overnight. The 1990s in Russia were catastrophic for the former middle class. Poverty exploded. Life expectancy dropped. The Soviet middle class extinction was perhaps the most sudden. Decades of savings destroyed in months. It shows that stage 8 can be a sudden collapse where the middle class is financially obliterated. Japan's middle class extinction is happening right now. And it's the most similar to America's trajectory. In the 1970s and 1980s, Japan had the strongest middle class in the world. Over 90% of Japanese identified as middle class. Lifetime employment was the norm. Housing was expensive, but accessible. Education was excellent. Savings rates were high. This was stage 2, the peak. Japan seemed invincible. But stage 3 began in 1990, when the asset bubble burst. Japanese real estate and stock prices collapsed by 60 to 80%. Companies stopped offering lifetime employment. Wages stagnated. And they've been stagnant for 30 years now. Japanese workers today earn essentially the same nominal wages they earned in 1990. 35 years of zero wage growth. Stage 4 is ongoing. Housing in Tokyo remains extremely expensive relative to wages. Education is still costly. Healthcare is good, but the population is aging rapidly. The Japanese middle class can't afford the lives their parents had. Stage 5 is polarization. Japan has developed a two-tiered society: regular employees with some security, and irregular employees, contract and part-time workers, with no security, no benefits, and low pay. The irregular workers are 40% of the workforce now. They're locked out of middle-class life. They can't afford marriage or children. Stage 6 is mobility collapse. If you're born into an irregular worker family, you're likely to be an irregular worker. If you don't get into a top university, you're locked out of the best jobs. The path to success has narrowed dramatically. Stage 7 is where Japan is now. Political disillusionment is widespread. Young Japanese have given up on the system. They see no point in working hard because it won't lead to prosperity. Birth rates have collapsed to 1.3 children per woman, one of the lowest in the world. Not because Japanese don't want children, but because they can't afford them. This is stage 7. Loss of faith, loss of hope. And stage 8 is ahead. Japan isn't facing revolution, but they are facing demographic and economic decline. The middle class is shrinking. The population is shrinking. The economy stagnates. Stage 8 in Japan might be a slow fade rather than a crash. But the middle class extinction is happening. Japan went from 90% middle class in 1980 to maybe 60% today. Now let's trace the United States through all 8 stages in detail, because this is where we are today. Stage 1 began in 1945. World War II ended. America was the only major industrial power not destroyed by the war. We had 50% of global GDP. Jobs were plentiful. The GI Bill sent millions to college for free. Housing was cheap. A modest home cost about 2 times your annual salary. You could buy a house at 25 on a single income. Healthcare was affordable. A doctor's visit cost a few dollars. Major surgery was expensive, but manageable. And most importantly, unions were strong. Approximately 35% of the workforce was unionized back then. These unions were responsible for negotiating wage increases that directly reflected productivity gains. Essentially, when companies experienced greater profitability, the workers shared in that success through raises. This era is often remembered as the golden age of the American middle class. The second phase, the peak of this era, spanned from 1945 to 1970. During this time, the American middle class reached its largest size and strongest position. By 1970, roughly 60% of Americans identified as middle class. It was a time when a high school diploma could lead to a stable factory job, the ability to purchase a home, support a family, and eventually retire with a comfortable pension. College was either inexpensive or even free at many state-run institutions. Students could often cover tuition costs simply by working a summer job. Social mobility was a tangible reality. The majority of people achieved a better standard of living than their parents. Upward mobility rates were remarkably high, around 90%. This is the period that many grandparents fondly recall, a time when the American dream felt attainable and when hard work genuinely translated into prosperity. This was the high point, but unfortunately, it was about to come to an end. The third phase began in the 1970s and gained momentum after 1980. This period marked a divergence between wages and productivity. From 1948 to 1973, productivity surged by 97%, and wages followed closely behind with a 91% increase. They essentially moved in tandem, meaning workers benefited from economic expansion. However, from 1973 to 2020, productivity continued to climb, rising by 62%, but wages only increased by a meager 17%. This created a significant gap of 45 percentage points. The benefits of increased productivity were primarily captured by executives and shareholders, leaving workers with minimal gains. What caused this shift? One major factor was the decline of unions. Union membership plummeted from 35% in 1970 to just 10% today. Without the collective bargaining power of unions, workers lost their leverage in wage negotiations. Additionally, tax rates on the wealthy were drastically reduced. The top marginal tax rate went from 70% in 1980 to a mere 37% today. Financial deregulation allowed Wall Street to accumulate wealth at an accelerated pace. Globalization led to the relocation of manufacturing jobs overseas. The entire system was reorganized to favor capital over labor. As wages stagnated, the middle class increasingly relied on borrowing to maintain their accustomed living standards. Consumer debt rose dramatically. Credit cards became widespread in the 1980s. By the year 2000, the average household carried approximately $8,000 in credit card debt. By 2025, that figure had soared to over $17,000. Average auto loan amounts also increased significantly, from $24,000 to $40,000. The middle class was essentially accumulating debt simply to afford basic necessities. This characterized Stage 3, stagnant wages coupled with rising debt. Stage 4 emerged in the 1990s and intensified after 2000, characterized by asset inflation. Housing prices began to escalate at a much faster rate than wages. In 1970, the median house price was roughly twice the median income. By 2000, it had risen to 4 times the median income. By 2025, it had reached a staggering 7 times the median income. Relative to wages, housing had become twice as expensive as it was for previous generations. College costs experienced an even more dramatic increase. In 1970, a year at a public university cost around $400. Adjusted for inflation, that would be approximately $3,000 today. However, the actual cost is closer to $25,000, which is 8 times higher than inflation-adjusted figures would suggest. College transformed from something easily achievable through summer employment to something requiring significant debt. Student loan debt soared from virtually nothing in 1970 to a staggering $1.7 trillion today. The average borrower owes around $40,000, with many owing over $100,000. Healthcare costs also skyrocketed. In 1970, a family spent roughly $1,500 per year on healthcare, which was about 8% of their income. Today, the average family pays over $20,000 annually just for insurance premiums, in addition to deductibles that can range from $5,000 to $10,000. This means families are spending between $30,000 and $40,000 on healthcare, which represents over 40% of the median income. Healthcare has transitioned from being affordable to potentially bankrupting. This defines Stage 4. The essential components of middle-class life, housing, education, and healthcare, became increasingly unaffordable. While previous generations could afford all three on a single income, many families today struggle to afford any of them even with 2 incomes. Stage 5 involves wealth polarization, which has reached extreme levels. In 1970, The top 1% of earners controlled 23% of the nation's wealth. Today, they control 32%. The top 0.1%, consisting of approximately 130,000 households, now possess more wealth than the bottom 90%, which encompasses 117 million households. This situation is even more skewed than during the Gilded Age or the 1920s. The disparity between the wealthy and the middle class is the widest it has ever been in recorded American history. The wealthy primarily own assets that appreciate in value, such as stocks, real estate, and businesses. The middle class, on the other hand, relies on wages that have stagnated. As assets inflate while wages remain stagnant, the gap between the two widens into a vast chasm. Stage 6 signifies the demise of social mobility, and this is where hope begins to fade. In 1940, 90% of children earned more than their parents. By 1980, that figure had dropped to 50%. Today, it's a mere 40%. The majority of people are now doing worse financially than their parents. Upward mobility has collapsed. If someone is born into the bottom 20% of income earners, they only have a 7.5% chance of reaching the top 20%. The promise of a better future is fading. Education no longer guarantees advancement. A college degree often leads to an entry-level job paying $45,000, while saddling the graduate with $40,000 in debt. Hard work no longer ensures prosperity. It's possible to work 60 hours a week and still be unable to afford a house. The system that once rewarded hard work is now broken. This is Stage 6, the death of the American dream. Stage 7 represents the current state of affairs in 2025, political instability. Trust in Congress stands at a dismal 15%. Trust in the Supreme Court is eroding. Trust in the media is at an all-time low. Approximately half of the country believes elections are rigged, while the other half views the events of January 6th as a coup attempt. Neither side trusts established institutions. The social contract has been broken. Political extremism is on the rise on both the left and the right. The left is seeing increasing support for socialist policies, wealth redistribution, and holding the wealthy accountable. On the right, there's growing support for authoritarianism, strongman leaders, and extrajudicial measures. The moderate center is shrinking. Why is this happening? Because the middle class, and what remains of it, recognizes that the system is rigged. They understand that working hard no longer guarantees prosperity, that the game is fixed, and that their children are likely to be worse off than they are. When people lose faith in the possibility of reforming the system, they turn to extreme ideologies. This is Stage 7, the point where we currently stand. History suggests that Stage 7 inevitably leads to Stage 8. Let's be clear about the current situation in America. We are in Stage 7. Political instability is fueled by the economic destruction of the middle class. The statistics confirm this. The median house price is $420,000, while the median income is $60,000. This means a house costs 7 times the median income. Previous generations only needed to earn 3.6 times the cost of a house. Today, it requires nearly double that. The average rent is $2,000 per month, which consumes over half of a person's take-home pay. Student loan debt has reached a staggering $1.7 trillion. Medical debt is a contributing factor in 66% of bankruptcies. The middle class, defined as households earning between $50,000 and $150,000, has shrunk from 60% in 1970 to 50% today. And even that 50% is barely holding on. A single medical emergency, job loss, or major expense can push them out of the middle class and into the working poor. The younger generations, Millennials and Gen Z, essentially lack a middle class. They are destined to rent indefinitely, burdened by massive debt, and unable to afford children. Birth rates are declining, not because young people don't desire families, but because they simply cannot afford them. The American middle class is not slowly fading away. It is in Stage 7 of an 8-stage extinction pattern. And what awaits us in Stage 8? History presents 2 potential outcomes: economic collapse or revolution. Economic collapse is what occurred in Rome and the Soviet Union. The currency becomes worthless, savings are wiped out, and the economy disintegrates. The middle class is financially devastated. This could potentially happen if the U.S. dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency, if the national debt becomes unsustainable, or if inflation spirals into hyperinflation. The structural problems within the American economy, including $36 trillion in debt, $2 trillion deficits, and excessive money printing, could lead to such a collapse. Revolution is what transpired in France. The middle class, radicalized by economic ruin, demands violent change. We have not yet reached that point, but the warning signs are emerging. Political violence is on the rise, as evidenced by Occupy Wall Street, the January 6th Capitol riot, and various protests and riots. Both the far left and the far right are openly advocating for the dismantling of the existing system. When the middle class has nothing left to lose, revolution becomes a distinct possibility. However, history teaches us that revolution does not save the middle class. It ultimately destroys them in a different way. The French middle class played a significant role in initiating the revolution, only to be consumed by it. The third option, one that history rarely presents, is reform. Dramatic policy changes aimed at rebuilding the middle class. These changes could include higher wages, affordable housing, free education, universal health care, wealth redistribution through taxation, breaking up monopolies, and strengthening labor unions. It is a possibility. FDR implemented such reforms in the 1930s, but it took the Great Depression to catalyze those changes. Even then, it required World War II to fully implement them. Reform without a crisis is a rare occurrence. Can America reform itself before reaching stage 8? Perhaps. However, the pattern suggests it is unlikely because stage 7 is characterized by a political system so polarized and dysfunctional that reform becomes virtually impossible. The wealthy block meaningful reform, extremist ideologies prevent compromise, and the system inevitably drifts toward stage 8. Your grandparents were likely members of the middle class. You probably are not, and it's not your fault. You are experiencing an 8-stage middle-class extinction event that has historically destroyed every major empire over the past 2,000 years, including Rome, Spain, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and Japan. Each of these empires created a thriving middle class and then systematically destroyed it, following the same pattern. Wages stagnated, debt increased, assets inflated, wealth polarized, opportunity diminished, faith eroded, instability ensued, and ultimately, collapse or revolution occurred. The United States entered stage 1 in 1945 and reached stage 2 by 1970. We built the strongest middle class in world history, and then we methodically dismantled it. Stage 3, wage stagnation, began in the 1970s.